My father said, "You'll never amount to anything," at graduation. His company never recovered from what I did next. I was 17 when I realized my father had never seen me as a son, but as a walking disappointment. For as long as I could remember, Alexander Reeves had treated every achievement of mine as a fluke, and every setback as confirmation of my inherent worthlessness. Nothing I did was ever good enough. Not my grades, not my athletic abilities, not even the way I tied my shoes. So when I graduated second in my class with a full scholarship to Princeton, I foolishly thought he might finally show a glimmer of pride. Instead, as we stood in the school parking lot after the ceremony, my graduation cap still on my head, he looked at my diploma with disdain. "Second place is just the first loser, Dominic," he said, barely glancing at me. "You had every advantage and still couldn't make valedictorian. Let's be realistic. You'll never amount to anything." He checked his watch impatiently. "I need to get back to the office. The company doesn't run itself while I waste time at these things." He walked away without another word, leaving me standing alone as other families celebrated around me. My mother had died when I was 10, and since then, it had just been me and my father. Or rather, me versus my father. Alexander was the founder and CEO of Reeves Financial Services, a mid-sized investment firm that managed nearly $2 billion in assets. His identity was completely wrapped up in his company, and he expected me to follow in his footsteps, despite making it abundantly clear he didn't think I was capable. For years, I had tried desperately to earn his approval, shaping my entire existence around gaining his respect. Now, standing in that parking lot, something inside me finally broke. I decided in that moment that I would show him exactly what I was capable of, not by seeking his approval anymore, but by systematically dismantling the company he valued more than his own son. It wouldn't be quick, and it wouldn't be easy, but I had nothing but time and motivation. My father had spent years teaching me that I was worthless. I would spend years proving him catastrophically wrong. That night, while he worked late as usual, I sat alone in our cavernous dining room pushing food around my plate. The house felt as empty as it always did, a showpiece mansion in the wealthiest part of town that had never felt like a home. The walls were lined with my father's achievements, framed magazine covers featuring his face, awards for business excellence, photographs of him shaking hands with politicians and celebrities. There wasn't a single family photo on display. My mother's presence had been carefully erased after her death, and mine was barely acknowledged. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the day's photos that other families had posted online. Proud parents hugging their graduates, siblings making funny faces, grandparents wiping away tears of joy. Normal families celebrating a milestone together. I had none of that. What I did have was a father who had made it explicitly clear that I was nothing but a disappointment to him, and a lifetime of being told I would never measure up. For years, I had believed him. I had internalized every criticism, every dismissive comment, every comparison to more successful students or the children of his business associates. I had accepted his narrative that I was fundamentally lacking something essential, that killer instinct he so prized in himself and found so pathetically absent in me. But staring at those family photos, something shifted inside me. What if he was wrong? What if his assessment of me wasn't the objective truth I'd always assumed it to be, but simply another tool he used to maintain control? I stayed up late that night researching financial regulations and compliance requirements for investment firms. If I was going to take down Reeves Financial, I needed to understand exactly how these companies operated, where the vulnerabilities lay, and what kinds of violations could trigger investigations. It was the beginning of what would become an obsessive study of the financial industry and its regulatory framework. That summer, instead of preparing for Princeton, I began the first phase of my plan. I applied for an entry-level position at Blackwell Investments, one of my father's main competitors. Using my mother's maiden name, Keller, I secured a job in their mailroom, positioning myself to learn the industry from the ground up. When I informed my father of my decision to defer Princeton for a year to gain work experience, his reaction was predictably dismissive. "Running away from real challenge as usual," he said during one of our rare dinners together. "Princeton will be too demanding for you anyway. Better to figure that out now than waste everyone's time later." He cut into his steak, not bothering to look up at me. "What's this job?" "Something suitably mediocre, I assume." "Mail clerk at Blackwell Investments," I replied, watching his knife pause momentarily before continuing its precise movement. "Blackwell?" Now he did look up, something like amusement crossing his features. "Harold Blackwell's operation? That second-rate outfit that keeps losing clients to us?" He laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Well, I suppose it's fitting. A mediocre firm for a mediocre talent." I maintained a neutral expression. "It's a foot in the door. I thought you'd appreciate me learning the business." "There's learning the business, and then there's sorting mail," he replied. "But I suppose you need to start at a level commensurate with your abilities. Just don't expect me to find you a real position at Reeves when you inevitably wash out there." He returned his attention to his meal. "Real success requires killer instinct, and you've always been too soft." I let his words wash over me, no longer allowing them to cut as deeply as they once had. Each insult now strengthened my resolve rather than diminishing my confidence. I recognized these interactions for what they were, not truthful assessments of my character or potential, but the insecure ramblings of a man who couldn't form normal emotional connections, even with his own child. My first day at Blackwell Investments was eye-opening. Unlike the cutthroat environment my father had always described, the company culture was professional but supportive. Harold Blackwell himself made a point of greeting new employees, regardless of their position, and the orientation process emphasized ethical business practices and client service rather than just profit maximization. It was my first glimpse into the possibility that my father's way of doing business wasn't the only way, or even the best way. I threw myself into the job with a dedication that surprised my supervisors. I arrived early, stayed late, and learned everything I could about the company's operations. I volunteered for additional responsibilities, offered to help other departments during busy periods, and used my lunch breaks to study financial regulations and compliance requirements. After hours, I pored over industry publications, SEC filings, and financial news, building my knowledge base while formulating my long-term strategy. Within 3 months, I had been noticed. My supervisor, Alicia Vaughn, called me into her office one afternoon. "Dominic, your performance has been exceptional," she said. "You're clearly overqualified for the mailroom. Is there a particular department you're interested in learning more about?" This was the opportunity I'd been waiting for. "Actually, I'm very interested in compliance," I replied. "I've been studying financial regulations in my spare time, and I find the legal framework fascinating. I think ensuring proper adherence to rules is the foundation of a trustworthy financial institution." Alicia raised her eyebrows, clearly not expecting that response from someone in an entry-level position. "Most young people want to get into trading or client management, where the action is," she said. "Compliance is important, but it's usually not the first choice for ambitious newcomers. I believe understanding the rules thoroughly is essential before you can effectively operate within them," I explained. "Besides, compliance touches every aspect of the business. It seems like an excellent way to learn the industry comprehensively." My rationale impressed her, and within a week, I had been transferred to the compliance department as an assistant. My new supervisor, Robert Finley, was a former SEC investigator who had transitioned to the private sector after 15 years with the government. He became an invaluable mentor, not just teaching me about regulatory requirements, but sharing insights into how investigations were conducted, what triggered regulatory attention, and how firms typically tried to hide violations. "The thing most people don't understand about financial regulations," Robert told me during one of our mentoring sessions, "is that they're not just arbitrary hoops to jump through. They exist because someone, somewhere, found a way to abuse the system at others' expense. Every rule has a story behind it, usually a story about someone losing their life savings." This perspective reinforced my determination. If my father was cutting corners at Reeves Financial, as I suspected he might be, he wasn't just breaking rules. He was potentially harming real people who trusted him with their financial futures. Meanwhile, at home, my father continued his campaign of belittlement. When I told him about my transfer to compliance, he scoffed. "Compliance? That's for people who don't have what it takes to actually make money in this business. Just pushing papers and checking boxes." His dismissiveness only strengthened my resolve. If he saw compliance as beneath him, then he likely wasn't paying close attention to it at his own company, a vulnerability I could eventually exploit. "I find it intellectually stimulating," I replied mildly. "Understanding the legal framework that governs the industry seems valuable?" He laughed. "Intellectual stimulation doesn't build wealth. Action does. Decisiveness, risk-taking, all the qualities you've always lacked." He shook his head. "But I suppose it's good you're finding your level. Better to excel at something minor than fail at something significant." Every conversation with him followed this pattern. Any achievement of mine diminished, any interest dismissed. I documented these interactions in a journal, partly to maintain my focus on the long game, and partly to ensure I never forgot why I was doing this. The journal became a record of his emotional abuse, a reminder of the years of damage he had inflicted, and a blueprint for my eventual retribution. By the end of my first year at Blackwell, I had established myself as a rising star in the compliance department. My meticulous attention to detail, comprehensive understanding of regulations, and ability to spot potential issues before they became problems had earned me the respect of my colleagues and supervisors. I had been promoted from assistant to analyst, bypassing the usual timeline for advancement. I deferred Princeton for a second year, explaining to the admissions office that I was gaining valuable practical experience in finance. My father's reaction to this decision was predictably scornful. "Running away from real challenge as usual," he said, unconsciously echoing his comment from a year earlier. I expected nothing less. At least Princeton won't have to waste resources on someone who clearly doesn't belong there. "I'm learning a tremendous amount at Blackwell," I replied. "The experience seems more valuable than classroom theory at this point." He snorted. "What exactly are you learning in the compliance department of a second-tier firm? How to file papers correctly? How to avoid taking risks?" He shook his head. "My son, the mail clerk turned paper pusher. The Reeves legacy ends with me, it seems." I let that comment hang in the air between us, saying nothing. If he only knew how prophetic those words would prove to be. During this time, I cultivated relationships with young professionals from other financial firms around the city, positioning myself as someone eager to learn. At industry mixers, continuing education seminars, and networking events, I made a particular point of befriending employees from Reeves Financial, junior analysts, administrative assistants, and IT staff who felt underappreciated by my father's management style. I never mentioned my relationship to Alexander, having taken my mother's maiden name professionally to avoid the connection. These relationships proved invaluable as sources of information. Over drinks or coffee, these employees would share their frustrations about working at Reeves Financial, the punishing hours, the cutthroat competition, the fear-based management style. More importantly, they occasionally let slip details about business practices that raised serious compliance concerns. "Your boss sounds intense," I commented to Ryan, a junior analyst at Reeves, during happy hour at a downtown bar. We had met at a financial technology seminar and bonded over our shared interest in regulatory technology. Ryan snorted. "Intense doesn't begin to cover it. Alexander Reeves makes Gordon Gekko look like a humanitarian." He took a long sip of his beer. "Last month, he ripped apart the entire trading desk because a client was questioning their returns. Told us to fix the numbers before the client meeting the next day." "Fix the numbers?" I asked, keeping my tone casual even as my interest sharpened. "What did he mean by that?" Ryan glanced around before leaning in. "Look, Reeves expects certain returns for premier clients, regardless of market conditions. When those returns don't materialize naturally, there are adjustments made." "Sounds questionable," I observed. "Doesn't that create compliance issues?" "Compliance?" Ryan laughed bitterly. "That department exists to find ways around regulations, not enforce them. Our head of compliance is basically Reeves's personal yes man. His job is to justify whatever Reeves wants to do, not raise concerns." He shrugged. "It's how business gets done there. You either play along or you're out." This conversation, and dozens like it, confirmed my suspicions about my father's operation. The picture that emerged was of a company where ethical corners were regularly cut, where regulations were seen as obstacles to be circumvented, and where employees were pressured to participate in questionable practices or risk their jobs. By the start of my third year in the industry, I had been promoted to compliance analyst at Blackwell and had built an extensive network of disgruntled employees at my father's company. I began meeting them more regularly, listening sympathetically as they complained about the toxic work environment at Reeves Financial. Through these conversations, I learned that my father had been cutting corners on compliance for years, pressuring his staff to overlook questionable transactions to maintain the firm's impressive returns. Mia, a compliance officer at Reeves who was actively looking for a new position, provided particularly valuable insights. "It's always just this once," or "make an exception for this important client," she confided after several drinks. "But those exceptions have become the rule. I've raised concerns, but your boss just says, business is business, and threatens to replace anyone who won't play ball." Another junior analyst told me about client funds being temporarily misallocated to cover losses in other accounts, a serious violation that could trigger regulatory investigation if discovered. "It's always fixed before the quarterly reports," he explained nervously, "but it's happening more and more frequently." I documented everything meticulously, gathering dates, transaction details, and names of involved parties. I still hadn't revealed my true identity to these sources. They simply knew me as Dom, a sympathetic colleague from another firm who understood their frustrations. Over the course of 6 months, I compiled evidence of at least 8 serious regulatory violations at Reeves Financial, each one potentially devastating if brought to the attention of the Securities and Exchange Commission. These violations included commingling of client funds with operational accounts, misleading performance reporting to clients, failure to disclose conflicts of interest in investment recommendations, manipulating transaction timing to enhance reported returns, improper allocation of trades among client accounts, misleading marketing materials that exaggerated historical performance, inadequate cybersecurity protocols, exposing client data, failure to maintain proper records of trading decisions and rationales. Any one of these violations could trigger regulatory action. Together, they painted a picture of systematic disregard for rules designed to protect investors. Meanwhile, my relationship with my father had deteriorated further. He now openly referred to me as his perpetual disappointment, and had stopped asking about my career entirely. At one point, he suggested I change my last name to spare the Reeves reputation. Each cutting remark strengthened my determination to expose his hypocrisy, the man who belittled me for lacking killer instinct while building his success on fraud and manipulation. "You know, Dominic," he said during a rare dinner at home, "I've been thinking. Perhaps it would be better if you used your mother's maiden name professionally." He didn't look up from his plate as he made this suggestion. The Reeves name carries certain expectations in financial circles, and given your chosen path, it might be simpler for everyone. "I'm already using Keller professionally," I replied calmly. "Has been since I started at Blackwell." He looked up, surprised. "Really? Smart move, I suppose. Saves me having to explain why my son is pushing papers in compliance while his peers are making actual contributions to their firms." I smiled thinly. "I prefer to make my own way, on my own merits." "Merits," he repeated, as if testing an unfamiliar word. "Is that what we're calling it? Hiding in the compliance department of a second-rate firm? Avoiding any position where your performance might be measurably evaluated?" I maintained my composure. "Every position in finance has measurable outcomes, Father. Mine happens to be preventing regulatory violations that could cost the firm millions." He waved his hand dismissively. "Cost prevention isn't value creation. It's the financial equivalent of a safety inspector at a factory. Necessary, perhaps, but hardly where the real work gets done. He took a sip of his wine. Still, I suppose someone has to do those jobs. Not everyone can be a leader. These interactions became increasingly rare as I spent more time at my apartment downtown, using my father's home only when necessary to maintain appearances. Each conversation reinforced my conviction that he would never see my worth, no matter what I achieved. The only language he understood was power and money, and I was preparing to speak to him very eloquently in both. The next phase of my plan required more direct access to Reeves Financial's internal operations. I approached Catherine Donovan, the senior manager of client services at Blackwell, and expressed interest in client acquisition. I know Reeves Financial has some vulnerable accounts due to their customer service issues, I said carefully. I'd like to try bringing some of them over to us. Catherine studied me thoughtfully. That's an ambitious target. Reeves's clients tend to be loyal despite their service issues. The returns keep them satisfied. Returns aren't everything, I replied. And from what I've heard, some of their clients are starting to ask questions about how those returns are being generated. With my compliance background, I think I could make a compelling case for our more transparent approach. Impressed by my initiative, she gave me the green light to pursue this opportunity. Start with smaller accounts that might not get much attention from Reeves, she advised. Build from there, and keep me updated on your progress. Using my network of contacts, I identified several clients who were dissatisfied with my father's firm, but hadn't yet taken their business elsewhere. I arranged meetings with them, presenting detailed analyses of how Blackwell could better serve their needs. During these conversations, I subtly probed for information about unusual practices they might have observed at Reeves Financial. The meetings were revelatory. Diana Mercer, the CFO of a manufacturing company with a $50 million portfolio at Reeves, mentioned casually that she had noticed discrepancies in her quarterly statements that were always explained away as administrative errors. It's strange, she said, frowning. The errors always seem to occur in months where market performance is down, but our reported returns remain steady. When I've asked for detailed transaction records, there are always delays or excuses. Another client, Gregory Lawson, a wealthy retiree with a substantial inheritance managed by Reeves, complained that his withdrawal requests were sometimes delayed for weeks without clear explanation. Alexander always smooths it over personally, he explained. Sends a bottle of wine, makes excuses about administrative backlogs, but it's happening more frequently now. Most concerning was my conversation with Judith Montgomery, trustee for a family foundation with over $100 million under management at Reeves. We've started receiving performance reports that don't match the statements from our custodian bank, she explained. When we've raised this with our account manager, he gets defensive and suggests we're misreading the documents. Alexander Reeves himself called me last month to assure me everything was fine, but wouldn't provide the specific documentation we requested. I added these details to my growing file of evidence, building a comprehensive picture of systematic misconduct. By this point, I had amassed documented evidence of at least 12 different regulatory violations, many of them serious enough to trigger significant penalties. More importantly, I had identified clients who were already suspicious and might be willing to cooperate with investigators. At home, I maintained the facade of the disappointing son, still living under my father's roof while supposedly finding my path. In reality, I was building the case that would ultimately destroy him. The irony wasn't lost on me. My father had taught me to be ruthless in pursuit of success, never imagining I would turn those lessons against him. Still at Blackwell? He asked one evening, glancing up from his tablet where he was reviewing market reports. I'm surprised they've kept you this long in compliance. Not exactly a revenue-generating position. I've actually been moved to client acquisition, I replied, while maintaining my compliance responsibilities. That caught his attention. Client acquisition? You? He seemed genuinely amused by the concept. Selling requires confidence, persuasiveness, the ability to project success, not exactly your strong suits. I shrugged. I've been exceeding my targets so far. Must be very modest targets, he replied dismissively, returning to his tablet, or very desperate clients. Little did he know that his own clients were among my prospects, and that several had already begun the process of transferring their accounts to Blackwell based on my recommendations. The man who believed I lacked sales ability was losing millions in assets under management to my efforts, without having the slightest idea. As my evidence mounted, I began the final phase of my plan. I created a secure, anonymous email account and reached out to Samantha Rivera, a senior investigator at the Securities and Exchange Commission whom I'd met at an industry compliance seminar. I have documented evidence of serious violations at Reeves Financial Services, I wrote. Multiple instances of fund misallocation, misleading client statements, and failure to maintain proper separation between accounts. I attached redacted versions of some of the documents I'd collected, promising more if the SEC would open a formal investigation. Within a week, I received a response requesting a confidential meeting. I agreed, with the condition that my identity be protected throughout the process. The meeting took place at a nondescript coffee shop downtown. Samantha was younger than I expected for a senior investigator, perhaps in her late 30s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a no-nonsense demeanor that commanded respect. I handed over a USB drive containing meticulously organized evidence of years of violations, including dates, transaction details, and statements from clients and employees, with their identifying information removed to protect them. "This is comprehensive," she said, after reviewing the files on her laptop. "How did you come by this information?" "I have contacts at Reeves Financial," I replied carefully. "People who are concerned about the firm's practices but fear retaliation if they come forward directly." She nodded, unsurprised. "That's common in these situations. But eventually, we'll need witnesses willing to go on record. Anonymous tips can start an investigation, but testimony wins cases." I assured her that when the time came, I could help identify potential witnesses. What I didn't reveal was that I had been recording conversations with disgruntled employees for months, with their knowledge and consent, under the premise of documenting toxic workplace practices for a business school project. These recordings contained admissions of compliance violations directed by senior management, specifically by my father. "This is enough to open a formal investigation," Samantha confirmed. "We'll need to move carefully, though. Reeves is well connected politically, and will face significant resistance." "I understand," I replied. "I'm prepared to provide additional evidence as needed." She studied me curiously. "Most whistleblowers have a personal stake. They're former employees with grudges, or competitors seeking advantage. What's your interest in this?" I maintained a neutral expression. "I believe in regulatory compliance. When firms like Reeves break the rules, they undermine trust in the entire financial system." She seemed skeptical, but didn't press further. "I'll be in touch as the investigation progresses. Keep this meeting and any future communications absolutely confidential." 2 weeks later, SEC investigators arrived unannounced at Reeves Financial with subpoenas for records related to the transactions I'd identified. The company was thrown into chaos as investigators seized computers and files, interviewing staff members about compliance practices. My father called me that evening, agitated in a way I'd never heard before. "The SEC is conducting a witch hunt against me," he fumed, pacing the living room with a tumbler of scotch in hand. "Probably put up to it by my competitors who can't match my returns legitimately." I expressed appropriate concern while secretly savoring the irony. My father, who had built his success through corner-cutting and intimidation, now claiming to be the victim of unfair targeting. "I'm sure it will all blow over," I said innocently. "Your company is too respected to face serious consequences." But it didn't blow over. As the investigation progressed, more violations came to light. Former employees, emboldened by the SEC's interest, came forward with additional evidence. Clients began withdrawing their funds as news of the investigation spread through financial circles. Reeves Financial's stock price plummeted, and creditors became nervous about the firm's stability. I watched the unfolding disaster with a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction, certainly, in seeing my plan succeed beyond my expectations, but there was also a strange emptiness. The revenge I had so meticulously orchestrated was bringing me less pleasure than I had anticipated. What did fill me with genuine satisfaction was the knowledge that clients who had been defrauded would potentially recover their losses, and that employees who had been pressured into unethical behavior were finally free to speak the truth. Throughout this period, I continued my rise at Blackwell, having been promoted to senior compliance analyst based on my exceptional performance. I used this position to facilitate the transfer of several major clients from my father's crumbling company to ours, further accelerating Reeves Financial's decline. Each account transfer was another nail in the coffin of my father's empire, and concrete evidence of the business acumen and client relationship skills he had always claimed I lacked. 6 months into the investigation, the SEC filed formal charges against Reeves Financial and Alexander Reeves personally, citing pervasive and systematic violations of securities laws. The criminal complaint included wire fraud, securities fraud, and fiduciary breaches spanning nearly a decade. The financial media covered the story extensively, with headlines declaring the fall of a financial titan and questioning how such violations could have gone undetected for so long. The Wall Street Journal ran a particularly devastating profile titled "The Emperor's New Clothes: How Alexander Reeves Built a Financial House of Cards." The article detailed how my father had systematically misled clients, regulators, and even his own staff, creating an illusion of financial genius that masked commonplace fraud. Former employees were quoted describing a toxic culture of fear and intimidation, where raising concerns about compliance issues was career suicide. My father was devastated. His reputation, the thing he valued above all else, was in tatters. His colleagues abandoned him, his social circle evaporated, and his company faced bankruptcy. When he was released on bail after his arraignment, he returned to our house a broken man, aged years in a matter of days. I found him sitting in the dark in his home office, surrounded by framed magazine covers and industry awards that now seemed like relics from another life. "It's all gone," he said, not looking at me. "Everything I built, my legacy, destroyed." For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Then I remembered all the years of belittlement, the casual cruelty, the constant message that I would never be good enough. "Sometimes life doesn't turn out the way we expect," I said, echoing words he had often used to dismiss my accomplishments. "But I'm sure you'll bounce back. Resilience is key, right?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. Something in my expression must have given me away because sudden understanding dawned in his eyes. "It was you," he whispered. "You did this to me." I didn't confirm or deny it. I simply held his gaze steadily. You always said I lacked killer instinct, I reminded him, that I was too soft to succeed in your world. He stared at me with a mixture of shock and, strangely, something that almost looked like respect. You destroyed a billion-dollar company just to prove me wrong? No, I corrected him. I exposed a corrupt organization that was breaking the law and harming its clients. The fact that it was your company is just poetic justice. All these years, he said slowly, I thought you were weak, soft, incapable of making hard decisions. A bitter laugh escaped him. And all along you were planning this. Systematically, patiently. He shook his head in disbelief. You're more like me than I ever realized. I'm nothing like you, I replied coldly. I didn't do this for power or wealth or ego. I did it because it was right, because your clients deserved better than to be defrauded, because your employees deserved better than to be terrorized into compliance with illegal practices. Spare me the sanctimonious bullshit, he snapped, a flash of his old arrogance returning. This was revenge, pure and simple. You wanted to hurt me because I hurt you. At least have the balls to admit it. I considered his words. Maybe there was an element of that, I conceded. But unlike you, I found a way to align my personal vendetta with the greater good. Your clients will recover some of their mismanaged funds. Your employees will find better positions elsewhere. The financial system will be marginally more honest without your corrupt influence. So yes, I wanted to hurt you, but I did it by exposing the truth, not by manipulating lies. The great moral crusader, he said sarcastically. So righteous, so pure. He drained his scotch. You think you've won, don't you? That you've finally proven your worth by destroying mine? I don't need to prove my worth to you anymore, I replied. I stopped seeking your approval the day you told me I would never amount to anything. Since then, I've built my own success, on my own terms. Success? He laughed bitterly. Hiding in compliance at Blackwell? That's your idea of success? I'm the youngest senior compliance analyst in the firm's history, I pointed out. I've brought in over 200 million in new accounts this year alone, and I did it ethically, legally, and without compromising my principles. I moved toward the door. Maybe that doesn't meet your definition of success, but it meets mine. He stared at me with a mixture of anger and bewilderment. I don't understand you, he said finally. I never have. No, I agreed. You never tried. 3 days later, facing mounting evidence and the prospect of decades in prison, my father took a plea deal that required full cooperation with investigators, disgorgement of illegal profits, and a lifetime ban from the securities industry. Reeves Financial was placed into receivership and eventually sold off in pieces for pennies on the dollar. The man who had built his identity around being a financial genius was now known only as a sophisticated fraudster. In the aftermath, I finally accepted my place at Princeton, having deferred for the third and final time. On my last day at Blackwell Investments, Catherine Donovan took me aside. You've accomplished more in 3 years than most people do in a decade, she said. The clients you've brought in, the compliance improvements you've implemented, it's exceptional work. Thank you, I replied simply. I've learned a lot here. She hesitated, then asked the question that had clearly been on her mind. The Reeves financial collapse? It happened right after you started targeting their clients. And I couldn't help noticing that Alexander Reeves shares your last name, your real last name. I maintained a neutral expression. A coincidence, I said smoothly, though it does explain why I was particularly motivated to help their clients find a more ethical home for their investments. She looked skeptical, but didn't press further. Well, whatever the connection, you've got a remarkable future ahead of you. The way you handled those client transfers alone saved them millions. Whatever you choose to do after Princeton, you're going to be extraordinary. My father's words echoed in my mind as I packed for college. You'll never amount to anything. I smiled to myself, thinking of the man who had once seemed so powerful, now awaiting sentencing in a federal holding facility. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just proving someone wrong, it's forcing them to witness exactly how wrong they were. At Princeton, I thrived in ways that surprised even me. Without the constant weight of my father's disapproval, I discovered aspects of myself I hadn't known existed. A talent for debate, a passion for economic justice, a genuine interest in regulatory theory. I maintained contact with Samantha Rivera at the SEC, occasionally providing additional context for the ongoing investigations into former Reeves financial executives who had enabled my father's fraud. I graduated with honors and was accepted to Princeton Law School, deciding to focus on securities law with the goal of eventually working for the regulatory agencies that protected investors from people like my father. Throughout this time, I sent him regular updates about my achievements, not seeking approval anymore, but ensuring he understood precisely what I was capable of, despite his predictions to the contrary. During my second year of law school, I received an unexpected letter from him. By this point, he was serving his 8-year sentence at a minimum security federal prison in Pennsylvania. I hadn't visited him, though he had requested meetings several times. The letter was brief and surprisingly reflective. Dominic, I've had a lot of time to think in here. About you, about how I treated you, about why I couldn't see what was right in front of me. Maybe I was afraid you'd surpass me if I ever acknowledged your potential. Maybe I was trying to protect you from disappointment by ensuring you never aimed too high. Or maybe I'm just a fundamentally flawed person who never learned how to be a father after your mother died. Whatever the reason, I was wrong. About you, About everything. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I understand now what I couldn't see then. You didn't just amount to something. You became someone extraordinary, not because of me, but in spite of me. Alexander. I read the letter several times, searching for the manipulation, the angle, the hidden agenda, but for perhaps the first time in my memory, my father's words seemed genuinely sincere. It didn't erase the years of emotional abuse or instantly heal the damage he had done, but it was an acknowledgement, finally, that he had been wrong about me all along. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I focused on completing my law degree and securing a position at the SEC's Enforcement Division, the same department that had investigated and prosecuted my father. When I finally wrote back to him, nearly a year later, it was to inform him of my new position and to thank him for the unintentional motivation his doubt had provided throughout my life. Your belief that I would never amount to anything became the foundation upon which I built everything, I wrote. So, in a way, I suppose I should thank you. Without your constant disapproval, I might never have discovered what I was truly capable of. 5 years after my father told me I would never amount to anything, I had graduated from Princeton Law School with honors and accepted a position at the SEC's Enforcement Division. My father, serving his 8-year sentence at a minimum security federal prison, received my graduation announcement in the mail. I never visited him, but occasionally I sent updates about my career, each one a silent reminder of the potential he had failed to see. The man who believed I would never amount to anything now had nothing but time to contemplate just how monumentally he had underestimated his son, and I had finally proven, to him, but more importantly, to myself, that his assessment of me had been wrong from the beginning. I had amounted to something significant, a person of integrity, capability, and purpose, a person who had faced his deepest wounds and emerged stronger, a person who had transformed his pain into purpose and found a way to succeed not by emulating his father's corrupt methods, but by exposing and correcting them.